I never thought a guy who keeps bees for a living could turn out to be the most unexpectedly romantic person I've ever met. Honestly, I thought beekeepers were all about bugs and weird hobbies, not the kind of guys you catch yourself daydreaming about. But that's exactly how it started for me one lazy Saturday afternoon when I wandered into the little farmer's market on a whim and met him. So picture this. I was just killing time, sipping on a cold brew coffee, and browsing through some stalls that mostly sold homemade jams and weird herbal soaps. Then I noticed a tiny stand tucked away in the corner, with a few jars of honey on the table and a guy who looked way too chill for a market vendor. He had this scruffy beard, those kind of bright, clear eyes that made it easy to get lost in conversation, and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. The sign said, Eli's Apiary. I'm not gonna lie, I was curious but skeptical. Beekeeping seemed like one of those niche things people do, and I was definitely not expecting to be drawn in by a guy selling honey. But when Eli started talking about bees, it was like he was describing the whole world through these tiny buzzing creatures. He didn't just drone on about the technical stuff, he made it sound kind of magical, like he was their guardian or something. We ended up chatting for way longer than I planned. I learned that Eli had been tending his bees just outside the city for a few years, and that he'd recently started selling honey to support a small sanctuary he was building. That's when it hit me. Here was this guy who wasn't just selling a product, he was pouring a part of himself into it. And honestly, that was way more attractive than I expected. At some point during our conversation, Eli peeled back a corner of his glove and dipped his finger into a jar of honey he just opened. Without missing a beat, he held out his sticky finger and said, "Want a taste?" And I did. It was the most delicious, smooth honey I've ever had, sweet but not overpowering, warm like the afternoon sun we were standing in. I couldn't stop looking at him after that. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he talked about things that mattered to him, and the quiet confidence he carried without trying too hard. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe this was going somewhere, or if I was just caught up in a moment that would fade once I left the market. But as I stood there, honey still lingering on my lips, I knew one thing for sure. This was the start of a story I didn't want to end anytime soon. I wiped my finger off on the edge of my shirt, trying to act casual, but inside I was definitely scrambling a bit. There was something about the way Eli looked at me after that. The slight tilt of his head, like he was weighing whether I was worth the trouble or just another curious customer. I guess I felt the same, though I was nowhere near as smooth as he was. "So are you always this easy to talk to?" I joked, hoping to break the silence that was settling between us after I licked the honey off. He chuckled, a deep, warm sound that caught me off guard. "Only when I'm talking about something I love," he said, then glanced down at the jars on his table. "And sometimes when I meet someone who doesn't run away after finding out I keep bees." I laughed, a bit embarrassed but feeling oddly at ease. "Well, bees are pretty intimidating. I mean, they're tiny flying stingers with a vendetta. I'm amazed you're not covered in welts." Eli shrugged like it was no big deal. "They don't sting unless they have to. You just have to understand them, respect their space. It's kind of like people, actually." That line stuck with me more than I expected. Maybe it was the way he said it, or the earnest look in his eyes. I found myself wanting to know what else he thought about that way. "Have you always been into bees?" I asked, trying to sound casual but genuinely curious. "Since I was a kid," he said, eyes lighting up. "My grandpa had some hives, and I'd help him out every summer. There's something about watching them work together that calms me down, even on the worst days. Plus, it feels good to care for something so small that's actually kind of a big deal for the planet." I nodded, impressed. There was a kind of quiet passion in the way he talked about it. Not flashy, not over the top, just real. "So what about this sanctuary you mentioned?" I asked, leaning in a little as if I could hear the bees buzzing behind his words. Eli's expression softened. "It's a place I'm working on, just outside the city. Not just for bees, but for other animals that need a safe spot. It's been a dream for a while. Right now, it's mostly me, a couple of volunteers, and a whole lot of hope." "Sounds like you're building something pretty special," I said, impressed. "Trying to," he smiled. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." We traded a few more stories after that, me about my job in a bookstore, and my terrible collection of half-finished novels, him about the quirks and challenges of beekeeping. The sun shifted, casting long shadows over the market, and the buzz of the crowd began to dwindle. Before I knew it, Eli packed up his jars, sliding the lids back on carefully. "You're not in a rush, are you?" he asked, glancing at me with those easy eyes. "Not really," I admitted. "Honestly, I wasn't planning on sticking around this long, but, well, you make bees sound way more interesting than I thought." He laughed, the kind of laugh that makes you think maybe everything's gonna be okay. "Want to see the hives? It's just a short drive. I promise it's not as scary as it sounds," he said. I hesitated for exactly a second before nodding. Something about the idea of going out to his sanctuary, even if just for a little while, felt right. Maybe it was the honey still sweet on my tongue, or the way his smile had a kind of quiet invitation that I couldn't refuse. The drive was peaceful, the city noise fading behind us as we rolled down a narrow road lined with tall trees. Eli talked about the land, how he'd found it, the plans he had, and the small victories he'd had with the animals there. I listened, genuinely interested, feeling like I was stepping into a part of his world that not many people got to see. When we got there, the sun was starting to lower behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the fields. The hives stood in neat rows, their wooden boxes buzzing softly. Eli pulled on his gloves and coat, his movements practiced and gentle. "Want to help me check on them?" he asked, holding out a glove. I hesitated, more like panicked a little, but the way he looked at me was patient, steady. I slipped my hand into the glove and followed him to the first hive. He showed me how to lift the frames gently, pointing out the queen, the drones, and the workers. I was surprised by how intricate and delicate the whole thing was. The bees weren't aggressive at all, more like busy little dancers doing their part. At one point, a few bees clustered near my glove, and I froze, heart pounding. But Eli just smiled. "They can sense when you're nervous," he said softly. "Try to breathe." I did, and the buzzing felt less like a threat and more like a rhythm. Watching him work, so calm and focused, I realized there was something incredibly intimate about this shared silence and trust. After we finished, Eli took off his gloves and reached into one of the jars again, scooping a thick ribbon of honey onto his finger. Without hesitation, he held it out to me. This time, I didn't hesitate. As I tasted the honey, sweet and golden under the fading light, I felt a spark between us that had nothing to do with the bees. Maybe it was the quiet beauty of the moment, or the way he looked at me like I was something precious. I don't know. All I knew was I wanted more of this. More days that started with honey on my lips and ended with the possibility of something real buzzing quietly in the air between us. That night, as I drove back to my apartment with the windows down and the cool air rushing in, I couldn't stop replaying the afternoon in my head. Eli's smile, the hum of the bees, the taste of that honey, stuff you wouldn't think would stick with you after a single afternoon, but somehow it all settled in like it belonged. I wanted to text him, but I hesitated. Part of me was afraid I'd come off as too eager, or, worse, like some guy who gets weird after a nice conversation. But when my phone buzzed with a message from him just as I was pulling into my building, I felt a surge of relief. "Glad you didn't run when you saw the bees. Hope the honey still tastes good." I typed back something casual, something like, "Still sweet, thanks for the tour today." But honestly, I wanted to say so much more, to ask if he wanted to hang out again, maybe somewhere less buzzy and with fewer flying stingers. Over the next few days, we texted back and forth. Not a lot, just enough to keep things alive without rushing it. He'd send pictures of the sanctuary, the animals he'd rescued, a scruffy dog wagging its tail, a few chickens pecking around, and sometimes little facts about bees that made me smile or shake my head at how much I was learning. One evening, Eli invited me over to his place, a small loft near the edge of town that smelled faintly of pine and something earthy. I didn't expect anything fancy. He kept it simple, like his whole vibe. When I got there, he was in a faded t-shirt and jeans, sitting on a threadbare couch with a book in his lap. "Come in," he said, standing up and giving me that same easy smile. We talked for a while about our days, the things that stressed us out, and the weird quirks that made us who we were. There was no pressure, just this comfortable back and forth that felt like catching up with someone you've known forever. At one point, Eli got up and disappeared into the kitchen. When he came back, he had a jar of honey in one hand and a loaf of fresh bread in the other. "I figured you might want to try some more," he said, slicing the bread and spreading honey thickly on a piece. "No bees involved this time." I laughed, accepting the offering. We sat close, and as I took a bite, I caught his eyes watching me, a quiet kind of kindness in them that made my heart pick up speed. "You know," he said softly, "it's kind of funny. I spend so much time with bees and animals that I sometimes forget how to just be with people." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Yeah, people can be complicated, but you make it easier," he said, looking down for a second before meeting my gaze again. That moment hung between us, fragile, but full of promise. I felt a nervous excitement, this fluttering in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Without overthinking it, I reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in slowly, his breath warm against my skin. When our lips met, it was soft and tentative at first, like testing the waters. But then it deepened, and I realized I hadn't known how much I needed this. The closeness, the connection, the simple act of being seen and wanted. Afterwards, we stayed like that for a while, just holding each other and watching the shadows shift in the room. I felt safe, like I could finally breathe without holding back. In the days that followed, we fell into a rhythm. Visits to the sanctuary, quiet dinners, long walks through the park, where Eli talked about his plans and dreams with an almost childlike enthusiasm. I couldn't get enough of it or of him. One afternoon, as we sat on a picnic blanket surrounded by wildflowers near the hives, Eli turned to me with this look that made my stomach twist. "I want you to meet someone," he said, a little hesitant. I frowned, curious. "Who?" "My bees," he said with a grin. "They're kind of nervous around new people, but I think they'll like you." I laughed, but then I saw the seriousness in his eyes. "I'm ready if they are." He reached over and squeezed my hand, and in that moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. The bees, the honey, and this unexpected guy who had turned my world upside down. I had no idea where this was going. But for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. Because with Eli, even the smallest things, a taste of honey, a quiet conversation, a shared smile, felt like the start of something real, something worth holding on to. And honestly, I wasn't ready to let go. Meeting the bees was nothing like I'd imagined. When Eli said he wanted me to meet them, I pictured some kind of awkward introduction, like the bees would be buzzing aggressively, or I'd have to wear one of those huge beekeeper suits and look like a giant marshmallow. But it turned out to be, well, kind of magical. We got to the sanctuary early one morning, the kind of crisp spring air that felt fresh and full of promise. The sun was just beginning to warm the earth, and the whole place smelled of wildflowers and damp soil. Eli led me gently toward the hives, his hand warm around mine, steadying me more than I expected. "All right," he said softly, pulling on his gloves and jacket. "You ready?" I nodded, even though I still felt like a nervous mess. Eli's calmness was contagious, though, and I found myself taking a deep breath and trying to relax. He opened the first hive carefully, and the bees hummed like a living thing, a low, steady vibration. Eli pointed to a frame, explaining how the bees worked together, how the queen was the heart of the colony. I watched, fascinated, as he moved with such ease. I swear he could speak their language or something. Then he turned to me with a small smile. "Go ahead. Hold out your hand." I froze for a second, then did as he said, palm up. A few bees landed on my skin, their tiny legs tickling, but they didn't sting. It felt surreal, like I was part of some secret world I'd never known existed. "They're not here to hurt you," Eli said quietly, kneeling next to me. "They're just doing their thing." I looked at him, and for a moment, our eyes met in a way that made my heart skip. There was something unspoken there, a vulnerability that wasn't about the bees, but about us, about trusting someone with that much. We spent the morning tending to the hives, Eli guiding me with patience and humor. When we finally stepped back, the sun high enough to cast golden light over everything, Eli pulled out a small jar from his bag. "Something to celebrate," he said, unscrewing the lid. It was thick, sticky honey, glistening like liquid gold. He dipped his finger in again, then held it out to me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I leaned in and tasted the honey, the sweetness richer somehow under the open sky. He smiled, watching me, and I felt myself smiling back, caught somewhere between shy and completely at ease. As we packed up, Eli surprised me by slipping his hand into mine. It felt natural, like something I'd wanted but never realized I needed. Over the next few weeks, things between us grew in this quiet, steady way. We'd spend hours at the sanctuary, or just hanging out at his place, cooking dinner and talking about everything from books to the strange quirks of city life. Eli's warmth was a kind of anchor I didn't know I'd been searching for. One evening, after a long day working outside, we found ourselves sitting on the porch swing at the sanctuary, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. "Do you ever think about the future?" Eli asked, his voice soft. I looked at him, the way the fading light caught in his hair, and realized I did, but not in the usual scary way. "I do," I said honestly. "But with you, it feels less like a question and more like a maybe." He smiled, squeezing my hand gently. I like the sound of that. That night, as we sat wrapped in a blanket under the stars, I felt something shift. It wasn't just about the bees or the honey anymore. It was about us, this fragile but beautiful thing we were building together. I knew there'd be challenges ahead. Life never made promises about smooth sailing. But with Eli, with his gentle strength and quiet passion, I was ready to face whatever came next. Sometimes, love shows up in the most unexpected ways. For me, it came buzzing softly, sweet as honey, and just as real. The longer I spent with Eli, the more I realized how much of a balm he was to my usual restless brain. I'm the kind of guy who overthinks everything. Work, social plans, even what to eat for dinner. But with him, things slowed down in the best way possible. Like the world didn't need to be so loud, so fast, so complicated all the time. One Saturday, Eli invited me to help with a bee harvest at the sanctuary. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was eager to learn more and to spend more time with him, even if it meant getting a little sticky. We showed up early, the sun still low and casting long shadows over the rolling fields. Eli was already in his gear, gloves, suit, veil, and looked kind of like a superhero in beekeeper mode. He laughed when I hesitated putting on my own veil, noticing how my hands trembled just a bit. "Don't worry," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "They can sense if you're nervous. Just breathe." I followed his lead, zipping up the suit awkwardly, but managed not to trip over myself. We moved through the rows of hives, Eli explaining each step with that calm passion that never failed to make me smile. When it came time to open a hive, he showed me how to gently lift out the frames heavy with honeycomb. We worked side by side, the buzz of the bees surrounding us like a strange, living soundtrack. At one point, a small bee landed on my glove, and I froze. Eli noticed immediately and said, "See? They're curious, not aggressive. Try to stay still." I did, and the bee soon flew off, leaving me with a newfound respect for these tiny creatures. After we finished harvesting, Eli led me to a picnic spot under a big oak tree. He pulled out a jar of fresh honey, the color deeper and richer than any I'd tasted before. He dipped his finger in and offered it to me, that same casual, intimate gesture from the first day. I took the honey off his finger, savoring the sweetness. But this time, I was more aware of the way his eyes held mine, the way his fingers lingered just a second longer on my hand. We sat there, the afternoon stretching out lazily around us, and I realized I was falling for him. Slowly, surely, like the honey dripping from the comb. It was the way Eli made me feel seen, calm, and safe. Like I could be exactly who I was without any pretenses. One evening, a few weeks later, we were back at his loft, cooking dinner together. The kitchen was small and cluttered, with jars of honey and bee-related books scattered around. I was chopping vegetables while Eli stirred something on the stove. He glanced over his shoulder and teased, "You're a surprisingly good chef." I smiled. "Only when I have a willing taste tester." He laughed and stepped closer, reaching out to brush a stray carrot piece from my cheek. That little touch sent a jolt through me, and I caught his gaze, suddenly nervous. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" "Yeah," I breathed. "Better than okay." Later, as we sat on the couch, Eli pulled me close, and for the first time, I felt him hesitate, like maybe he was wondering if what we had was real or just a passing thing. I looked up at him and whispered, "I want this, Eli. I want you." His eyes softened, and he kissed me, slow and sure, like making a promise. In that moment, I knew we were both stepping into something new, something that scared us but also thrilled us. The sanctuary became our shared world, a place where bees buzzed and hearts beat in sync. We planned together, dreamed together, and sometimes just sat in silence, wrapped up in each other's arms. Of course, life wasn't perfect. There were tough days, times when Eli was exhausted from work, or when I felt overwhelmed by my own insecurities. But through it all, we kept coming back to each other, like bees to honey. One night, after a long day at the sanctuary, Eli surprised me with a small box. I opened it to find a simple silver ring, delicate but meaningful. "I want to keep building this with you," he said quietly. No rush, no pressure, just us. I smiled, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Nothing would make me happier. We sat there, holding hands, hearts full, knowing that love, like honey, takes time to grow sweet. That ring, the way it caught the light, simple and unpretentious, felt like the most honest thing I'd ever held in my hands. I wasn't exactly the type to get swept away by grand gestures, but this was real. Quiet, steady, like Eli himself. I slipped it on my finger, feeling a mix of excitement and something deeper. Comfort, maybe, or the relief of finding a kind of home in someone else. Eli's smile was soft, filled with that same warmth I'd come to crave. We didn't say much after that, just sat together in the dim light of his loft, letting the moment settle around us. The days that followed carried a new kind of energy. It wasn't fireworks or dramatic declarations. It was the little things. Texts in the middle of the day, the way Eli's hand found mine when we walked through the sanctuary, the shared looks that said more than words ever could. One afternoon, I showed up at the sanctuary with a surprise of my own, a tiny picnic basket filled with food I'd made. Eli was busy tending the hives, his veil off, hair messy and sun-kissed. When he saw me, his face lit up in a way that made my chest tighten. "You didn't have to," he said, but his eyes said otherwise. We spread a blanket under a big old oak tree, the bees buzzing lazily around us. As we ate, Eli talked about the sanctuary's future, plans for expanding, maybe even hosting workshops to teach others about beekeeping. It was contagious, his enthusiasm. I found myself imagining a life that included this place, these bees, and him. Not just as a fleeting dream, but something solid, something we could build together. Later, as we packed up, Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "Want to see my plans?" he asked. I nodded eagerly, and he handed it over. The pages were filled with sketches, notes, and little reminders. Everything from layouts for new hives to ideas for community events. I could see the passion etched into every line. "You really put your heart into this," I said quietly. Eli shrugged, a little embarrassed. "It's not just about the bees. It's about creating something meaningful." I looked at him, and suddenly the words came out without thinking. "I want to be part of that. Of all of it." He smiled, and I swear the sunlight made his eyes look like they had their own kind of honey glow. "I'd like that." Our relationship, as much as it was built on easy laughs and quiet moments, wasn't immune to the usual bumps. There were days when work stress or personal doubts crept in, making us both pull back a little. But whenever that happened, we found our way back, sometimes with a simple text, other times with late-night calls, or just holding each other in silence. One evening, after a particularly long day, I showed up at Eli's place unannounced, hoping to catch him before he crashed. When he opened the door, sweat-streaked and tired, I held out a bottle of wine and a goofy grin. "Rescue mission?" he joked. "Exactly," I said, stepping inside. We ended up cooking dinner together, the kitchen filled with the kind of comfortable chaos that only happens when two people are figuring each other out. As the night wore on, we talked about everything: fears, hopes, the weird little things that made us who we were. At one point, Eli reached for my hand, his thumb tracing lazy circles on my skin. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I'd find someone who gets it." "Who gets me?" I squeezed his hand, my heart thudding. "Me too." That night, as we lay tangled together, I realized how much I'd changed since meeting him. The way my world had expanded, brightened by his presence. A few weeks later, Eli invited me to a local farmer's festival, a place where he sold his honey and talked to folks about beekeeping. I watched him work the crowd with that easy charm, sharing stories and handing out samples. After closing up, we walked hand in hand down the quiet streets, the sounds of the festival fading behind us. "Funny," I said, "how I almost walked past your stand that first day." Eli looked at me, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Yeah? Glad you didn't." "Me too." We stopped under a street lamp, the world narrowing down to just us. I leaned in, feeling the familiar thrill of his touch, the comfort of his presence. "Eli," I said, "thank you for the honey, the bees, and everything." He smiled, brushing his thumb over my cheek. "No, thank you." As we kissed beneath the glow of the lamp, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, a place woven together by the simplest, sweetest things. Honey on a finger, a shared dream, and the unexpected love of a beekeeper who taught me how to slow down and savor every moment. Months passed, and with each day, Eli and I settled into a rhythm that felt more like home than anything I'd known before. It wasn't about grand declarations or rushing towards some big milestone. It was about the quiet mornings, sharing coffee on his porch, the way his hand found mine without saying a word, and the small, steady moments that built something real between us. One late afternoon, we were at the sanctuary, sitting on the porch swing as bees hummed softly in the background. The sky was that perfect shade of soft blue right before sunset, and the whole world felt calm and full of possibility. Eli turned to me, his eyes gentle but serious. "You know, when I started this sanctuary, I never imagined it would lead me here, with you." I smiled, feeling the weight of those words settle warmly in my chest. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it did." He squeezed my hand, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small jar of honey. "This is from the newest batch. I thought maybe we could share it, like we did that first day." I took the jar, the golden honey gleaming in the fading light. As I tasted it, sweet, simple, and honest, I felt like it was more than just honey. It was a symbol of everything we'd built together, the trust and care poured into something fragile that turned out to be unexpectedly beautiful. We sat there side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the world quiet except for the soft buzz of our little bees. In that moment, I knew that love isn't always about big gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes, it's about the steady presence of someone who makes you feel safe, someone who lets you be yourself, sticky fingers and all. Eli looked over at me, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ready for whatever comes next?" I nodded, heart full and sure. "With you?" "Always." And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, I realized that some of the sweetest things in life come from the most unexpected places. A beekeeper, a jar of honey, and a simple, quiet kind of love that feels like home.